Now the phraseology which we have in chapter 13 is purely a development of the beast of the sea in the opening verses. The reference to that first beast, whose deadly wound was healed, takes us back to verse 3 of this 13th chapter, when we saw that one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And as we saw under the symbology of that beast, the 7 heads were representative of the 7 forms of government under which Rome was ruled. The 6th head was the imperial head, and that was the head which was in control of Rome when it was overthrown by the horn powers as represented in the beast of Daniel and also in the Apocalypse. And the 7th head, which took over from the imperial power of Rome, was the Gothic head. And it was the Gothic head which caused the downfall of the western part of the Roman Empire in AD 476. Then we have seen through the development of the beast of the sea in chapter 13 that although the barbarian tribes were to have their part to play in the downfall of the Western Roman Empire, Rome itself as a church appealed to the east, and there in Constantinople was the military power of Rome, but now moved over to the east as had been taken by Constantine, and therefore it was the Eastern Roman Empire which supported the church to overthrow the barbarian tribes in order to re-establish its authority in the west. And that's what we have seen in the beast of the sea in those first 10 verses of chapter 13. And therefore, although it wasn't the imperial Rome itself which had been restored, in essence, the 7th head had been overthrown in order to re-establish the power of the church in the west. And you'll notice, reference is made again at the end of verse 12, for example, the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. And again, at the end of verse 14, which had the wound by a sword and did live. This was the Roman church which had been given its authority again by the eastern power of the Roman Empire in order for it to continue and to prosper. The various emperors from the east, they supported and elevated the Roman church. And verse 11, although it's describing another beast, the very phraseology which used shows is purely an extension of the same power that we have beheld previously. The beast of the sea had the 7 heads and 10 horns, whereas the beast coming up out of the earth, this one in verse 11 had 2 horns like a lamb. And therefore the writer of this book pictures the beast coming up out of the earth with 2 horns like a lamb. But you'll notice that he spake as a dragon. What the rest of the body was, obviously, he doesn't tell us. The point we've got to appreciate is that he spake as a dragon and exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So the principle involved of this beast of the earth was exactly the same as the beast coming up out of the sea. It was to enable the Catholic Church to prosper and for all the world to worship this great monstrosity. Look at verse 4 of chapter 13. The Revelator there says, they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him. And we identified at that time the dragon representing the military power of the east, which gave its support unto the religious power in the west, to enable that to prosper and speak great words of blasphemy in verse 5 against the Most High. And you'll notice a similar situation now in verse 12. He was to exercise power in order to cause all the earth to worship the beast again. And therefore these 2 beasts of Revelation chapter 13 are linked by the very context of the chapter together. They are distinguished, A, in appearance, and B, by the very nature of what the words of the verses say. But they have got this common link that people will worship the beast. Now, the reason they are generally referred to as the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth is for the obvious reasons of verse 1 and verse 11. John saw in verse 1 the beast coming up out of the sea, whereas in verse 11 he sees the beast coming up out of the earth. So that's why the first one is generally referred to as the beast of the sea, the second one the beast of the earth. Now, what we want to do is to just take you forward a wee bit in history from the time of the beast of the sea, which will take us back to chapter 8 and chapter 9 of the Apocalypse. Now, chapter 8 and chapter 9 saw in the trumpets the overthrow of the Western and then the overthrow of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire in chapter 8 we have seen during the period of the first beast of the sea in chapter 13. The Gothic head replaced the imperial head, and then eventually after Rome in AD 476 had fallen, the church looked to the east, which had continued, for its support and its prosperity. Chapter 9 of the Apocalypse tells us that because of the Saracens and also the Ottoman power, the Eastern power also was to decline and fall towards the middle of the 15th century. So whereas in the early times it was able to support the church in the West, as the Saracens began to make inroads into the Eastern Roman Empire, it began to lose some of its power so that it was not able to support the church in the West. And what chapter 13 from verse 11 is going to tell us is the other power which comes upon the sea to support the papacy when the power of the East, the Eastern Roman Empire, was in the decline. So in verse 11 of chapter 13, I beheld another beast come up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And history records how the graphic fulfillment of these verses actually was to take place. Rome found itself attacked again by the barbarian tribes, this time by the Lombards. And the Lombards were one of the horns which we have seen as we have gone through the description of Daniel and the Apocalypse, one of the barbarian tribes which were to make the inroads into the Roman Empire. And it was the Lombards who attacked the land of Italy and Rome in particular and subdued the power of the papacy once again. Rome, inevitably, I'm talking about the church, it looked to the Eastern Roman Empire to protect it as it had done before, as we saw in the Beast of the Sea. It wanted them to be able to send again their military might to support it and to overthrow these barbarian tribes. Unfortunately, because of their own problems with the Saracen power, the Eastern Roman Empire was not able to support the papacy. There was also another problem. The Roman Catholic Church, which of course was not confined to the West, it was throughout the East and Western parts, had come in conflict, the one part with the other. The Catholic Church in the East, although controlled by the Bishop of Rome following the edicts of Justinian, found itself at variance with the Church in Rome over the worship of idols. The power in the East did not feel that it was right for the Christian Church to have idols. The power in the West, the Church of Rome, felt it was quite in order and proper for idols to be part of their worship. And therefore there was this great religious conflict between the church in the East and the church in the West over the worship of idols. This was linked to the decline of the Eastern power because of the inroads of the Saracens and subsequently by the Ottomans. And therefore when Rome, because of the invasion of the Lombards, appealed to the East for support, it didn't receive it. The East did not respond to the overtures of Rome. And therefore the Catholic Church in the West was faced with one of two situations. Either that it was going to be completely submerged under the rule of the Lombards, or it was going to look elsewhere for support. And therefore it looked towards Europe. And it saw in Europe a power that was gaining in ascendancy. And it was the power of the Franks under the rulership of one called Pepin. And Franks, of course, is France as we know it today, began to grow in power and authority. And because it was, in quotes, Christian in outlook, the papacy found an ally in Pepin and the rising power of the Franks. Pepin was later succeeded by his son Charlemagne, and Charlemagne was a great supporter of the papacy. And in a series of battles, Charlemagne and the Franks triumphed over the Lombards and the barbarians and released Italy and Rome from their domination. Charlemagne had got probably three motives in the battles which he fought against the barbarian tribes. One, of course, was his own personal ambition, because obviously, like most powers, he wanted to be the greatest power in the earth at that time. Charlemagne was no exception to personal motivation in causing him to try and be the greatest leader of men in the earth at that time. Secondly, the domination of other lands in order for the Franco power to grow and extend its dominion. But thirdly, and this is where the papacy received the benefit, he also wished to support the papacy and extend throughout the powers which he could dominate Christianity. And therefore, as in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire were finding through the inroads of the Saracens that the Saracens were trying to make them submit to that one God rather than the trinity of gods which they worshipped, being part of the Catholic system. So we find that in the West, the rising power of Pepin and then followed by Charlemagne and the Franks, as they grew in stature and extended their influence over many lands, they wanted to extend the influence of Christianity. And one of the conditions which they imposed when they conquered any nation or power was that that power had to submit to Christianity. And therefore the Pope found a great ally in Charlemagne, to the point that on Christmas Day, AD 799, it was the Pope himself who crowned Charlemagne. And the interesting thing about it, as far as we're concerned, is he crowned Charlemagne as Caesar Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. It was in AD 476 that Rome had fallen. It had lost its power. The barbarian tribes had won them over. The Gothic power was now in charge. Subsequently, through the help of the Eastern power, Rome again was given some freedom. But it never had an emperor or a ruler in the West. Charlemagne was now crowned as Emperor of the Romans. The power in the East was still there, although it was having a battering. The power in the East was going to exist for many a long century, until the 15th century. And yet the Pope had the audacity, without the power obviously, but he had the audacity to crown Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, and the Eastern power was powerless to do anything about it. Now this began what has become known in history as the Holy Roman Empire. It was not holy in the sense of what we know holiness. It was not Roman because it was the Franks who was the power which was in charge, and it was not an empire because it had no imperial state like Rome had before. But this is the principle, what we've got in verse 11, that he beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. In contrast to the sea, because all the other events had to do around the Mediterranean, this beast was to come out of the earth, out of Europe. And he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And the two horns are identified with the two powers which ruled the Holy Roman Empire. That on the one hand of the Emperor, Charlemagne, and on the other hand, the Pope. And the Holy Roman Empire always had those two dominant powers, as we would term them, the church and the state. And therefore these two horns had dual control over the beast system which had been developed. The religious one, obviously, was supported by the political one. But nevertheless, because the political one was Christianized, i.e. a supporter of the papacy, then obviously he recognized and acknowledged the edicts which went forth from Rome. Although he has got the political power, he will nevertheless obviously submit from a religious point of view to the Pope as being the head of the church. Whereas the Pope, to extend his influence in a particular country, needs the help of the ruler of that particular country. And it was more apparent in these days when the Holy Roman Empire came into being, with this dual situation of the military power, the political power, with the armies of the Franks, and the religious power of the papacy. You'll notice, although it was like a lamb, it spake as a dragon. And the dragon we have seen from chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13 always had reference to the military power. And that's what it was. It was military, it was political, but it gave the appearance of the lamb. And the lamb obviously symbolizing the religious aspect. In other words, that everything was done in the name of Christ. And most of Europe became annexed under this dual control of the French and the papacy. And the cry obviously was that it was all done in the name of religion. The Franks' power, after annexing back Italy and Rome, also then it extended its influence throughout Europe, and quickly Germany followed in the series of battles which it fought and won. And the power base after Charlemagne was to move from France to Germany, finally ending up in Austria. And that's why generally you will find that the Holy Roman Empire is spoken of as being Germanic in nature. But it wasn't. It was the Franks first of all who moved their power base from France to Germany and finally ending up in Austria. If you'll notice in verse 12, he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. The influence of Christianity was extended as the conquest of this Franco power gained in ascendancy. He exerciseth the power of the first beast, and causeth, as a result of his military conquest, all that dwell upon the earth to worship the power of the papacy. As we have got in verse 4, the dragon gave the power unto the beast. The East gave its support to the church. And so now, Charlemagne and the Franco power gave its support to the papacy. And when it made its conquest, it caused all those who had been conquered to worship the beast. In other words, they had to convert to being, as we would term it today, a Roman Catholic. They had to conform to Christianity. Back to Daniel chapter 7. Because Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8 is the very time period which we're now discussing. I considered the horns, and behold, another little horn, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And the 3 horns that were plucked up by the roots were the Vandals, the Lombards, and the Huns. And you will find in the conquest by Charlemagne, in order to restore the power of the papacy once again, in order for him to free Italy from the barbarian tribes, he had to overturn the power of the Lombards, who had taken over Italy, the power of the Huns, and the power of the Vandals, in order to re-establish the supremacy of the papacy in the earth, and to establish the Holy Roman Empire. And therefore it's generally been considered that verse 8 of Daniel chapter 7 is speaking about the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, as the papacy obviously from that time forward never looked back until the year 1866 to 1870, when it lost its power.